King Charles III is officially ascending to the British throne to be the new monarch. And for the first time in history, we're able to watch the ceremony at home from start to finish.
The sealed folder sat on the table between them. King Charles did not open it immediately. He looked at his son first, at Catherine, at Camilla, at Princess Anne, and in that silence, before a single word was spoken, every person in that private council chamber understood that what was about to happen could not be undone. This was not a routine meeting. No agenda had been circulated. No press secretary had been briefed. The summons had arrived without explanation, and that absence of explanation was its own kind of warning. When a king calls his family to a private council chamber without telling them why, the news waiting inside that room is never small. Charles opened the folder, and the British monarchy changed forever. What you are about to hear is the full story. The private confrontation no camera captured, the sealed envelope William refused to open, the moment Catherine stood alone against Camilla without a single advisor in the room, and the one handwritten sentence that explained everything Charles had been hiding for months. Stay with this until the end, because the final detail, the thing Catherine placed inside the completed coronation plan, is the part no royal commentator has fully addressed, and it may be the most important thing this family has done in a generation. The announcement that changed everything. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the public beginning, the real one. Charles had summoned 5 people to Buckingham Palace's private council chamber. William, Catherine, Camilla, Princess Anne, a small circle of senior advisors. No explanation had been given in advance. The uncertainty inside that room was not accidental. It was deliberate. The private council chamber is not used for routine conversations. It is reserved for decisions too sensitive, too consequential, and too irreversible for public debate. Everyone who entered that room knew that, which is why the silence before Charles spoke carried so much weight. When the king finally opened the crimson folder, he did not offer a preamble. He did not ease anyone into what was coming. He simply named the date, Saturday, the 14th of November 2026, Westminster Abbey, William's coronation. Think about what that means for a moment. Not as a news headline, as a human reality. The man sitting across that table had waited his entire life, through grief, through scandal, through public hostility, through decades of anticipation, to wear the crown. And now he was announcing the date he would give it away. William did not reach for the papers. He stared at his father and asked one question: why now? Charles looked down instead of answering. And that silence, that single moment of a king refusing to meet his son's eyes, communicated something no official statement ever could. The date had not been chosen casually. It had not been chosen conveniently. It had been chosen because something had happened, something Charles was not yet ready to explain in front of the full room. Catherine felt the fear beside William before he had the chance to process it himself, because becoming queen was not simply a change of title for her. It was a transformation of everything: her daily life, her privacy, the childhood her 3 children were still living. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis were not ready for what that crown would demand of them. And a mother sitting in that chamber understood that more completely than any courtier ever could. But then came the second shock. Charles announced that the emotional and symbolic design of the coronation, the music, the family placement, the royal tributes, the ceremonial structure, would be placed under Catherine's direct control. Not William's, not Camilla's, Catherine's. The room shifted. You could feel it without being there, because everyone understood what that decision meant, and not everyone in that chamber was prepared to accept it. Camilla's face hardened. The queen consort leaned forward. She had survived years of public judgment to sit beside that king. She had endured hostility that most people will never fully understand. She had a voice in this institution, and she intended to use it. But before she could speak, Charles closed the folder. He closed it. Camilla's objection died in her throat, and Princess Anne, watching from her seat with the measured attention of a woman who has spent decades reading royal rooms, understood immediately. This wound would not remain hidden. It would grow, and it would eventually force a confrontation that no closed folder could prevent. William finally placed one hand on the crimson cover, but he did not open it. Catherine rested her fingers over his wrist. No words, just that. And Charles watched them with an expression that mixed pride with something heavier, something that looked, to those paying attention, like grief. Then, Anne noticed something no one else had caught. Beneath Charles's chair, partially obscured, deliberately positioned, sat a second sealed envelope, William's initials on the front, 4 words beneath them, to be opened privately. The date had been announced, but the greater shock was still sealed, and Charles had not dared to open it in front of the family. Now ask yourself this: what could a king write to his son? A message so private it could not be shared in a room containing only the most trusted members of the royal family, that he chose to hide it under his chair rather than place it on the table? That question drove everything that followed. William's private reckoning. William left the council chamber without opening the envelope. He had spent years in constitutional briefings, studying state papers, learning the mechanics of sovereign duty. He had attended rehearsals, absorbed protocol, and prepared himself in every structural way a future king can prepare. But preparation had always existed at a comfortable distance. The crown was coming. Not yet. Later. Eventually. The confirmed date on the 14th of November ended that comfort permanently. Kingship was no longer a future responsibility. It was a fixed destination, and William was already standing on the road toward it, whether he felt ready or not. Catherine followed him into a private corridor. She waited until the doors closed. Then she spoke, not as a future queen, but as his wife, as the mother of his children, as the one person in that palace who was allowed to tell him the truth without ceremony. She told him that Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis would sense his fear before any courtier did. Children read their parents with a precision that no adult instinct can match. If William allowed panic to take hold, if the dread visible in that council chamber followed him home, his children would begin fearing the crown before they were old enough to understand what it represented. William gripped the sealed envelope. Catherine's words steadied him, but they did not remove the weight. Charles alone, the cost of the crown. Meanwhile, in his private study, Charles removed his spectacles and sat alone with a framed photograph of his sons. Pride, regret, both at once. That is what succession does to a father who is also a monarch. He had spent years preparing William to rule, yet the crown had slowly inserted itself between them, into every conversation, every shared moment, every future plan. Father and son could no longer discuss the future without feeling the transfer happening between them in real time. Camilla entered the study without warning. She asked Charles whether he had already begun removing her from the future. That is a devastating question. It deserves to be understood in full, because this was not jealousy. This was not ambition in the conventional sense. This was a woman who had stood beside a king through everything the institution had thrown at both of them, watching the architecture of the next reign being built and discovering that her name did not appear on the blueprints. Charles set down his pen slowly. He acknowledged her pain. He did not deny it. He had no intention of dismissing what she had carried beside him, but he refused to change the decision. And before Camilla could respond, Princess Anne found William in a separate corridor and told him something that altered everything. The date had not been chosen for administrative convenience. It was tied to a private promise made after an earlier family crisis, a crisis that had taken place inside Windsor Castle, a crisis Charles had never fully disclosed. William broke the seal on the envelope. Inside, one handwritten sentence. This date became inevitable after what happened at Windsor. What really happened at Windsor? What happened at Windsor? This is where the story goes deeper than any public announcement could reach. Months before the coronation date was confirmed, Charles had arranged a private continuity ceremony at Windsor Castle. The stated purpose was controlled and reasonable. Test how the senior family would respond if the monarch suddenly became unable to complete a major state duty, a rehearsal, a precaution, nothing more. That was what William believed. Catherine understood something more unsettling. The king was watching, not just observing a procedural exercise. He was examining discipline, loyalty, and emotional control under pressure. This was an audition for what the monarchy would look like after Charles, and every person in that room was performing without knowing the stakes. The exercise presented a fictional crisis, cancelled appearances, delayed state papers, urgent constitutional decisions. Then a senior court official asked the question that broke the exercise wide open. Who would lead if Charles could no longer carry out his duty? Camilla stepped forward before William could answer. The Queen Consort declared that no transition should happen without her approval. The room froze. Charles stared at her, not with anger, with disbelief. He had anticipated fear. He had prepared himself for resistance. He had not prepared himself for a claim of authority over succession itself. William remained silent, out of respect for his father's wife, out of loyalty to his father, and out of a constitutional understanding that this was not the moment to fight. But Catherine saw the danger in that silence immediately. William's restraint was being read as uncertainty, and uncertainty at the moment of succession is not a minor problem. It is an invitation for exactly the kind of rivalry and interference that fractures institutions. After the ceremony, Charles confronted William in a side chamber. The question was direct. Why had he not asserted himself? William's answer was equally direct. He would not fight Camilla for authority while his father was still standing. The words carried loyalty. They also exposed the structural weakness that happens when succession is left undefined. Catherine entered moments later and said what needed to be said. She told Charles that William's silence was not weakness, it was respect. But she warned him, clearly, without softening the message, that delaying the transition would allow other people to build influence around William before he had the tools to defend his own position. Charles removed his signet ring, the personal seal of royal authority, and placed it on the table between himself and his son. One day, silence will no longer protect you. That same night, the monarch instructed his private secretary to prepare a fixed coronation timetable, and in the same recorded planning memo, he placed Catherine at the head of the ceremonial planning council. The Windsor rehearsal had exposed the fracture, and Charles had responded by doing the one thing no one had expected him to do so soon. He started building William's future before anyone could interfere with it. Catherine and Camilla, the confrontation behind closed doors. But Camilla was not finished. When she learned through the documented account that Windsor had directly influenced the coronation date, she demanded a private meeting with Catherine. And this confrontation is the moment that most royal coverage has consistently underestimated. There were no advisors, no secretaries, no husbands, no palace officials, just two women, connected to the same crown, divided by what its future should mean. The meeting took place at Clarence House, Camilla's territory. A deeply personal choice of location. She had expected papers, perhaps a legal representative, certainly some form of palace bureaucracy standing between her and the future queen. Instead, Catherine arrived alone and empty-handed. The message was unmistakable. Catherine intended to speak as a future queen, not hide behind procedure. Camilla opened with an accusation. The new coronation plans, she argued, were allowing Charles to erase his own reign before it had even ended. Every removed tradition weakened the dignity of the crown he still wore. The continuity of the institution demanded respect, and what Catherine was building did not show enough of it. Catherine did not retreat. She answered that preparing William was not an attack on the king. It was protection against the chaos Windsor had already exposed to the entire room. The argument sharpened from there. Camilla told Catherine she could never fully understand what surviving inside the monarchy truly cost. She spoke of years of hostility, public judgment, isolation, the relentless weight of an institution that had treated her as an obstacle before it accepted her as a consort. She insisted that endurance had earned her a voice in the future. Catherine listened. Then she delivered the answer that changed the entire dynamic of the room. Survival, she said, could not become the institution's guiding purpose. Camilla then made two concrete demands: prominent seating for her family, a formal ceremonial role during the coronation service. Catherine refused both. She explained, calmly, without cruelty, that the coronation would center on constitutional continuity, the lawful passage of royal responsibility from Charles to William. It was not designed to distribute private rewards or signal personal loyalties. And then she revealed something Camilla had not anticipated. She showed her the signed planning instruction, recorded after the Windsor confrontation, in which Charles had personally ordered the removal of a disputed procession segment. The king had made the decision himself. This was not Catherine's ambition being imposed on the ceremony. This was the sovereign's explicit instruction in writing, with his name attached. Camilla could no longer frame this as a power grab by an overreaching princess. Camilla pushed her chair back and asked whether Catherine intended to become queen before the crown had even touched her head. Catherine rose, paused at the door, and answered with 7 words, "No, I intend to be ready when it does." Within hours, Camilla went directly to Charles and demanded he reverse the decision. The private confrontation was over, but the king would now have to choose between protecting his wife from humiliation and protecting his son's transition from interference. He could not do both, the hardest decision a king can make. Here is the question that every person watching the monarchy needs to sit with for a moment. When a king has spent his entire life waiting for the crown, when the institution he leads has defined every relationship, every sacrifice, every public and private choice he has ever made, what does it cost him to sign away his own authority before anyone has forced him to? Because Charles was not pushed. He was not pressured by illness into accelerating the timeline. He was not facing a constitutional crisis that demanded immediate action. He made a choice, a voluntary, deliberate, painful choice, and understanding why he made it explains everything that followed. Charles signs, and power begins to move. Camilla met Charles moments after leaving Catherine and demanded that he revise the ceremonial authority structure before the arrangements became public. She argued that allowing Catherine to dominate the coronation process would make the current reign look weak before it had ended. She told him Catherine's growing authority made her feel like a guest in the reign she had helped him survive. Charles acknowledged her fear. He understood it. He did not minimize the years she had endured beside him, but he also knew that the crown could not be governed by reassurance. The future could not be delayed simply to make the present feel safer. Princess Anne joined Charles afterward and found him sitting beside an unsigned order. She told him plainly what hesitation would cost. Every unclear instruction created rival centers of influence around William. Without firm limits, advisors, relatives, and private households would all begin competing for proximity to the future king. The transition schedule existed to prevent exactly that kind of chaos, and leaving it vague would guarantee it. Charles signed. The document confirmed that Catherine's ceremonial decisions could be overruled only by William or the king himself, not by Camilla, not by courtiers, not by extended relatives or outside advisors. Camilla read the first paragraph, closed the folder, removed her hand from his without a word. Charles did not stop her. The silence between them held the full cost of that decision. And then, almost immediately, the machinery began to move. Briefing folders were redirected. Meetings once chaired by Charles began appearing under William's name. Staff who had served one reign for decades were quietly instructed to prepare for another. Power had started moving before the coronation had even been publicly announced. For Charles, every transferred duty felt like a piece of his identity being removed. For William, every new responsibility arrived carrying the weight of his father's approaching absence. The prince received the phased transition schedule and understood why it mattered. But he watched palace officials begin treating his father like a man already departed, and he corrected them every time it happened. Charles remained the sovereign until the final moment. William insisted on that. No new title, no repositioned chair, no rerouted briefing order would be allowed to pretend otherwise. But there was one incident that stopped everything. Charles arrived at a scheduled briefing and found that his usual chair had been moved slightly aside, while William's seat stood at the center of the table. No announcement had been made. No insult had been declared. The placement simply existed, as if it had always been that way. William noticed his father's expression before anyone had the chance to explain or apologize, and he acted before a single word was spoken. He moved the chair back beside his own and said something that should be remembered long after this transition is complete. will not begin by pushing you away." Charles sat down beside his son, and for one brief moment, the crown did not divide them, father and son. The truth at Windsor. That evening, the king asked William to meet him alone at Windsor. No Catherine, no Camilla, no Anne, no courtiers waiting outside the door. The private room Charles chose was the same one where father and son had spoken after the death of Queen Elizabeth II. The choice of location was not accidental. The memories in that room were shared ones, and Charles wanted William to feel that history when he heard what was coming next. William entered expecting instructions. Charles gave him honesty instead. The king admitted that he had worried about waiting too long. He had seen what uncertainty produced at Windsor, the fractured authority, the competing claims, the dangerous confusion about who had the right to lead. He had watched Camilla step forward to fill a vacuum that should never have existed, and he had made a decision that night. He would not allow hesitation to become William's inheritance. The date, Charles explained, was not arbitrary. The 14th of November marked the anniversary of a private promise made years earlier, a conversation no courtier had witnessed, in which Charles had told his son that when the crown finally approached, William would not be left unprepared. Naming the date was his way of keeping that promise before illness, crisis, or external pressure could take the choice away from him. Then William spoke. The future king admitted that becoming monarch was not what frightened him most. What he feared, genuinely, deeply feared, was allowing the weight of the crown to create emotional distance between himself and Catherine, between himself and his children. Duty had already consumed pieces of their private life. He could not accept a reign that demanded what remained. Charles understood. He had lived that tension his entire life. The monarch told William that Catherine had been placed at the center of the coronation because she respected royal history without being imprisoned by it. Her role was not decorative, it was protective. She would guard the people entering the next reign from being consumed by the institutions surrounding them. Then Charles reached into his pocket and removed a small handwritten card. On it was the coronation oath he had once feared taking, the solemn promise a sovereign makes to serve the nation, uphold the law, and carry the responsibility of the crown. He placed it in William's hand. "Do not inherit my fear with my crown." William accepted the card, then set one condition of his own. He would accept the date. He would walk toward Westminster Abbey. He would take the oath and receive the crown. But he needed one thing from his father. Charles would not enter that abbey as a defeated monarch. He would enter as the man who had secured the succession, with dignity, with intention, and with the full authority of a king who had chosen this moment, rather than been forced into it. Charles agreed, and with that agreement, the battle was over. The nation reacts, and Camilla watches alone. At precisely 8 o'clock, Buckingham Palace released the announcement. Television schedules changed mid-broadcast. Newspaper presses restarted. Crowds gathered outside royal landmarks without being told to. Britain did not simply receive a piece of royal news. It confronted something it had been privately anticipating and quietly avoiding: the closing of one reign and the beginning of another. Camilla watched the first broadcast alone. She listened as the presenter described Catherine as the architect of the new ceremony, the woman who had shaped a coronation designed to carry royal history into a different era. She reached for the remote and lowered the volume, but she did not leave the room. Her silence revealed something more significant than anger. It carried the grief of someone watching the future take shape without her at its center. Catherine received the public reaction with the calm she had demonstrated throughout, but she understood the danger of celebration becoming something that looked like triumph over Charles. Through the official palace statement, she confirmed that Prince George would take part in the service, creating a visible link between 3 generations of kingship, while protecting Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis from ceremonial pressure they were not ready to carry. The statement also revealed a private family pledge. Before the coronation service began, before Westminster Abbey opened its doors to the world, Charles, William, and George would stand together. 3 kings, one reigning, one arriving, one waiting in the far distance of the future, connected by blood and duty, and a promise that no crown could replace. Outside Buckingham Palace, one image captured. everything the nation was feeling. A young boy held a handmade sign above the crowd. "Thank you, King Charles. We are ready, William." The image spread across television networks and dominated the following morning's front pages. One newspaper printed Charles on one side, William and Catherine on the other. Across the center, a single headline: "The crown passes with a father's blessing, the final gathering, and the last word." And then came the final gathering. Catherine entered the music room at Buckingham Palace, carrying the completed coronation framework, the formal structure deciding how every moment of the service would unfold, who would participate, and what each element would represent. She had built it to honor Charles's reign, establish William's authority, protect the children, and, despite everything, preserve Camilla's dignity within the limits the king had set. Camilla studied the final pages. She had believed from the beginning that Catherine's authority was designed to push her aside, that every ceremonial decision was an act of displacement disguised as planning. But the completed framework told a different story. Her place within the coronation remained. It was limited, it was clearly defined, but it was not erased. She did not offer warmth. She did not apologize for Windsor or Clarence House, or the demand that Charles reverse his own signed order, but she agreed to support the ceremony, without further resistance. That was enough. William turned to his father and thanked him for fixing the date before uncertainty could split the family. He admitted that delay might have allowed fear, ambition, and private influence to grow around the succession until the damage could not be repaired. Charles answered that preparing his son properly would become the most important act of his reign. He had spent decades waiting to inherit the crown. His final triumph would be giving it away with order, dignity, and complete intention. Catherine then revealed the ceremony's most personal detail. She had reserved the final words before William entered Westminster Abbey for Charles alone. No advisor would speak. No courtier would stand between them. Before the doors opened and the world received its new king, a father would tell his son that the crown passed with his full consent and his full blessing. Charles signed the completed plan beneath Catherine's name. William signed beside his father. Camilla signed last, and Princess Anne closed the folder. Prince George entered after the meeting concluded and asked William a question that stopped the room. "Does becoming king mean everything will change?" William knelt beside his son and answered, "Our duty will change. Our family will not." What the 14th of November really means: on the 14th of November 2026, William will walk toward the crown that has waited for him his entire life. Catherine will walk beside him, and behind them both, not as a defeated monarch, not as a man pushed aside by time or illness or family pressure, but as the father who chose this moment and shaped it. King Charles will take his place in Westminster Abbey. The monarchy did not fracture under the weight of this transition. It bent, it argued, it confronted itself in private rooms with no cameras and no official records. And then it chose unity over rivalry, preparation over delay, and a father's love over the last remaining grip on power. That is what the sealed envelope contained. That is what the Windsor rehearsal exposed. That is what Catherine stood alone in Clarence House to defend. And that is why the date on that crimson folder, announced in a room full of silence, received by a nation full of feeling, matters far beyond the ceremony it names. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because the story of this family is far from over. And the next chapter begins on the 14th of November.